and panels in the past 2 days. But today I'm presenting the Chinese position of the so-called principled neutrality, which has been controversial in the Anglo sphere, by the way. But let me start with a very quick definition of what principled neutrality really means for the Chinese. It's different from the typical permanent neutrality that we've been talking about. Someone would shut himself off from the diversity or complexity of the real world. No matter what's going on, I'll be myself. But Chinese version of neutrality is China does have its own thinking about what's right and wrong, and also try to work to promote the end of violence. For example, China strongly believes that the UN principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty should be preserved no matter what. And that is for the interest of Ukraine. China has never, ever retreated from that point. China has not recognized the seizure of Crimea and even the three, those border states of Ukraine. At the same time, Chinese also argued the root cause of the Ukraine conflict can be traced all the way to the relentless NATO eastward expansion. So that's something too need to be addressed for the enduring peace, not just for the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Chinese, but for the whole world in the age of weapons mass destruction and in artificial intelligence. To talk about who is going to win the war or Russia must be defeated, this is like something to talk about who is winning the earthquake in Mexico City or hurricane in South Carolina. No winners. And particularly the alternative is not something, it is unthinkable. So this is the Chinese version of neutrality or principled neutrality. We do have the belief or our own observation who is right, what is the source of the problem. So this is something I want to get. So for that, I want to talk briefly what I see the three main drivers or points I put here in a single sheet. And the current Chinese-Russian relationship is a major factor for the Chinese neutral stance. And the second major point is I want to put this Chinese neutrality in the context of the rise of the non-West or global South. And the third is I want to provide a cultural perspective, which is something perhaps less known from the outside. So let me start with my three strikes and I'll be out. Number one, I think there are two opposing sectors of literature now in the study of Chinese neutrality. One is the so-called, I see the proliferation of a strategic partnership or comprehensive partnership between Russia. The Chinese and Russian leaders talk about as, so many. I myself confused. At the same time, Chinese developed the same thing to many other countries. I forgot how many strategic partners China's have, by the way. I lost count of it. And this is one end, is an inflated notion about bilateral relationship. On the other side, you have the growing and more fashionable use of system of evil, access, authoritarianism, like my good friend of Professor Sutter in Georgetown University, and also Bobo Lo's book in 2008, The Axis of Convenience about China-Russian relations. So it's a proliferation of access. To demonize anything China, Russia do is a threat to the West. So the threat school. So I think my approach is, despite all those inflated, highly value-oriented notions of China-Russian relationship, basically Moscow, Beijing has been in a normal state. A normal state because this is the only first time ever since 1989 that the China-Russian relationship has been stable and equal and mutually beneficial. In the previous 200 plus years, ever since the beginning of 19th century, all the way till the end of Cold War, there had been a massive intrusion of the Russian/Soviet intrusion into China. First, in the format of colonialism. Russia joined the British, the French, the Japanese to carve up China and competing for their own influence. So this is all the way last to the 20th century, and then replaced by the Bolshevik and the Soviet, idealism and Stalin's brutal realism. And this was followed by what I see the honeymoon China-Soviet alliance, which was quickly switched to nightmare or hostility for the next 30 years, all the way till 1989. When the two countries normalize their relations. So this is a normal state, when the two sides start to see each other as who they are, not necessarily what they imagine. And this is the state of maybe like a marriage between, gender relationship is pretty much like an international relation. Chinese-Russian relation had been going through honeymoon and quickly switched to divorce. We never experienced any marriage, by the way. So now the normal state is like marriage, which is far more challenging, difficult, nuanced, when the two sides start to interact with one another. Those of you who are married, marriage is not something you can take for granted. You need to compromise. So this is something that two sides start to engage on the relatively equal position. It's a normal relation by any standard. So this is something I would say it's very, very different from the previous 200 years, when there's an overwhelming one-side intrusion and sweeping intrusion into Chinese domestic politics. Another point I want to address is the Russians' two borders. And in this case, I would say Russian-China border currently more than 4,000 kilometers long. It used to be 7,000. But the Soviet collapsed and leaving Central Asian state. And the two sides actually worked for 15 years from the beginning of the normalization in 1989 all the way to 2004, and to sign that final treaty to legalize the 4,000 kilometer line. And the SCO, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is a vehicle for the two sides to interact with one another, working together with the Central Asian states to create kind of like a buffer zone or a stable borderline, and inspected on an annual basis. So it started with this very painful, slow-moving, and then finally in 2004. So that was kind of a very important. If you look at the Western front, I mean, Ukraine or Russia's Western border is a totally different story. And now I'm wondering, what if the West did what the Chinese did to work with the Russians to stabilize the border? You may have a different, outcome. So this is the totally different two tales of the Russians' two borders. I'm not saying that the Chinese approach is better than the West, but it's a different approach. And we should examine it, see how nations settle down the long-term conflict for hundreds of years. China actually suffered so much, but did not take advantage of the weakening of the Russians. Maybe because the Chinese really believe what the Bismarck used to say, that Russia is not as strong or weak as it appears. Russia has tremendous potential, but also tremendous ability to mess around. But respect that a great power. Don't play with it. Because the previous history with Russia has been devastating for the Chinese, even for my generation. We used to blame the Russians for everything, or the Soviet imperialism. That's bullshit. After Cultural Revolution, the Chinese really examine our own problems. We don't blame others for our problem. Let's learn from everybody. That's Chinese opening and reform all about. So Russia is a very important element in China's perception of outside world. So I think that's, I really want to emphasize that I brought in George Kennan's 1997 New York Times piece, and he regarded NATO expansion as a fatal error. This was 2 years before the first wave of NATO expansion in 1999. But President Clinton conveniently ignored him. Maybe he was confused by Lewinsky, I don't know. But the rest was history. But the history never ends. So let me move to the second point. If you look at the long-term history, I want to pick up from Samuel Huntington's provocative treatise, The Civilizational Clash in 1994. In this article, he raised a concept that the entire history between West's failure to the end of the Cold War was one of Western, quote, civil war. Westerners killing Westerners. This is, I think it's a sweeping historical stroke, but Huntington somehow missed something important. This Western Civil War never meant to be Western. It meant colonization, control, slave trade, which is the first globalization. And then in both world wars, the non-West part was forced into fighting and fought on both sides. And the West really dictated the terms, and the non-West, the South, had no choice. And in World War II, Chinese were slaughtered 35 million, by the way, 27 Russians, but Chinese suffered most. So this is the first ever time you see the global South have both the willingness and ability to stay out of the Western Civil War 2.0, which is the Ukraine war. No matter how much the Russians say, we're not the West, by the way, anymore. But it is part of the Western Civil War. And the non-West would say, well, sorry, it's not our business. And at the same time, they try to push for more peaceful possible solution. Just last month at the UN annual conference, there is a creation of the Friends for Peace by 13 non-Western countries, and also including Egypt, Brazil, China, Turkey, and try to find a third way. By the way, there are many proposals going on, but I think this is one by the collective South. And I hope that this is maybe one of the efforts that would push for that. So that's the, I think that and China is part of this. I think another point is to see how this Chinese neutrality would work. And that is I would argue, it's a long way from 1954, when the non-aligned movement was launched. China, Yugoslavia, Egypt, Indonesia joined the non-aligned movement, and in 1954, and then lots of things going on, all the way to 1982, when China declared officially independent foreign policy, independent from both the West and the Soviet camp. That was 1982. 40 years later, we see the continuity of the neutrality in the Ukraine war. So this is it's not just the Ukraine war, but China has been continuously staying away from the East and the West. So this is and within the context of the global. Then finally, I want to move to the cultural element. I think I want to introduce this very, in 1997, the US House of Representatives published a resolution to commemorate the 2007 100 years of Confucius' birthday. And one of the major ideas of the House of Representatives, by the way, it was a past. It's amazing from today's point, because China has become a #1 enemy lots of people still love Russians, by the way. Lots of Ohioans would love Putin rather than the Democrats. But China become public enemy number one. But this isn't just, 1997. Don't do the things to the others if you don't want the others to do the same thing. And there are many other elements of Confucianism that is kind of advocated in this resolution. For example, like a great thinker, teacher, social philosopher, blah, blah, blah. But this is the one, to me, is something like a Treaty of Westphalia, right? Except it was 1,500 years before Treaty of Westphalia. And don't mess around other countries. So this is something that I would say. But I would be critical of this resolution because it missed the important core idea of Confucianism, which is the middle way. This is a square, right? And I don't stretch your imagination like a tennis court, volleyball court. The notion of the middle way is essentially draw a central line, like a typical sport court. And this is what the Chinese language means, the middle way, just middle. Chinese language is graphic, unlike Romanized or Latinized, just a picture. And this also means neutrality. And this also means China. So out of these sense of neutrality are two different type of international system. One is the Treaty of Westphalia, and all the way, you see, the ideas is equality, sovereignty, and the Chinese-based regional system is hierarchy, according to David Kang of University of Southern California. And totally the opposite. But if you look at the operating mechanism, Westphalia Treaty does not prevent war except religious wars. But other wars continue to fight. And out of the Treaty of the Westphalia, through those decades, 500 independent entities in Europe were reduced to 20. There's a large number of losers. Despite its declared principle of sovereignty and equality. Okay? And so many wars, Western or non-West. But if you look at the hierarchical system in East Asia, by the way, this is not democratic. It's not appealing to the hearts of many people in Asia now. I agree with them. Its old system is gone. But this system has based on a cultural influence and the notion of impartiality, which means this is Henry Kissinger's definition. Chinese notion of international means impartiality, not equality, not balance of power, but the cultural influence. The outcome of the Chinese regional system is remarkably stable, lack of interstate wars. So let me finish by showing the last. And this is David Kang's counting. You don't have to read it finally. So many wars on this side. This is the Westphalian system. And there's a little or nothing interstate wars, except the two blue, that the Chinese troops entered Korea and Vietnam and all eventually withdraw. The Chinese were remarkably aloof from interfering other countries' domestic affairs.